On the 26th of April, 2026, that sound signaled the end of an era and the beginning of a cold, calculated new reality. For decades, the woman standing at the center of the royal storm had grown comfortable. Camilla, the queen consort, likely believed that her position was secure, her family protected, and her influence over the king absolute. But as the ink dried on a set of historic documents, she was about to learn a lesson that every outsider in the House of Windsor eventually discovers. In the game of crowns, there is no such thing as permanent safety. The story we are about to uncover is not just about titles or public appearances. It is about the one thing that truly dictates who holds the power behind those ancient stone walls: land and money. When King Charles III sat down to sign the papers, transferring full authority over the Duchy of Cornwall to his eldest son, Prince William, he wasn't just passing on an inheritance. He was handing William the keys to the most powerful financial engine in the British monarchy, and in doing so, he effectively locked the door on the world Camilla had worked so hard to build for her own relatives. To understand why this moment sent shockwaves through the palace, you have to understand the sheer scale of what was handed to William. The Duchy of Cornwall is not some ordinary estate. It is a massive, sprawling portfolio of private land and assets spread across England and Wales. We are talking about tens of thousands of acres of agricultural holdings, massive commercial developments, and enough revenue to make even the largest global corporations sit up and take notice. For generations, this estate has been the lifeblood of the heir to the throne, providing the kind of independent wealth that allows a prince to act with total autonomy. Before that fateful day in April, William was the future king, a man waiting for his time. But the moment those documents were finalized, his status shifted. He became a man of immense, independent power. He was no longer just a son waiting for an allowance. He was the landlord, the CEO, and the ultimate decision-maker for an empire that touches every corner of the kingdom. And here is where the story takes a sharp, uncomfortable turn. Reports from deep within the royal circles suggest that while this massive transfer of power was happening, one person was notably absent from the room. Camilla was not sitting beside her husband as he signed away this authority. She was not consulted in the weeks leading up to the decision. She was not invited to review the paperwork or offer her perspective on how the transition should be handled. Instead, the narrative tells us that she learned about the full scope of the transfer after it had already been finalized, through the same cold official channels as everyone else. If you are Camilla, how do you process that? To be the wife of the king, yet to be treated like a stranger to the most important legal decision of his reign? It wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a public and private sidelining that felt deeply personal. Inside the palace, silence is often a weapon, and for Camilla, the silence surrounding this decision was deafening. She reportedly understood the implications immediately. This wasn't just about William getting his hands on a bank account. It was about authority. In the world of the royals, authority means the power to decide who is in and who is out. It means the power to look at old agreements, old favors, and old friends, and decide if they still have a place at the table. For years, Camilla's family had enjoyed a certain level of proximity to this wealth and influence. They were comfortable. They were settled. They were part of the inner circle. But William's new authority meant that their presence was no longer guaranteed. It was now a choice, and it was William's choice alone. The fallout of this decision has been described as nothing short of brutal. When we think of the monarchy, we think of the glittering crowns and the balcony waves, but the real battles are fought over ledgers and land titles. This transfer of the duchy was the first move in a much larger strategy, a strategy that many believe was set in motion long ago by the late Queen Elizabeth II. According to those who have followed this story closely, the late Queen left behind a set of very specific, very rigid legal instructions. These were not just suggestions. They were a blueprint designed to protect the future of the Windsor bloodline at all costs. These instructions allegedly contained provisions that made it nearly impossible for any outside commercial interests to influence the duchy's assets. They were designed to ensure that the wealth of the monarchy stayed within the direct line of succession, far away from the reach of anyone who wasn't a Windsor by blood. When William took control, he wasn't just acting on his own whims. He was executing a plan that had been decades in the making. He was the enforcer of a legacy that prioritized the institution over the individuals who had married into it. As William began to review the books, he didn't just see numbers. He saw names. He saw arrangements that had existed for years, some of which involved people very close to his stepmother. He saw business inquiries and land agreements that had been quietly ticking along in the background, shielded by the previous administration's sense of tradition and loyalty. But William's team was not interested in tradition for tradition's sake. They were conducting a modern, clinical audit of an empire. And that is where the first cracks began to show. One by one, the names of Camilla's relatives began to appear in the crosshairs of this new administration. It started with subtle questions about commercial opportunities and ended with a complete overhaul of how the duchy would operate moving forward. The comfortable world that Camilla's family had occupied was being dismantled, piece by piece, by a stepson who was now their boss in every sense of the word. As we move forward, we will see that this wasn't just a one-time disagreement. It was the beginning of a systematic removal of influence. From the business dealings of her son to the professional contracts of her sister, the message from William was clear. The era of the Parker Bowles influence was over. The gates were closing, and the keys were now in the hands of a man who remembered everything. But to understand the full weight of why William acted so decisively, we have to look closer at the specific people he targeted and the history that made their presence so intolerable to the new Duke of Cornwall. This was just the beginning of the storm, and as Camilla was about to find out, the most painful strikes were yet to come. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II was the ultimate guardian of the flame, a woman who understood that the survival of the monarchy depended on one thing above all else: the absolute separation of the crown from private interests. She had watched empires crumble and reputations vanish overnight, when the line between royal duty and personal gain became blurred. As the end of her reign approached, she was reportedly well aware of the complicated dynamics that would define her son's time on the throne. She knew that the arrival of the Parker Bowles family into the inner sanctum of royal life brought with it a new set of risks. And so, according to those who have seen the shadows of the palace archives, she prepared a silent, legal defense that would only be triggered long after she was gone. This hidden mechanism is what some have called the Windsor Protocol. It consists of a series of strict legal instructions designed to act as a steel cage around the monarchy's most valuable assets, specifically the Duchy of Cornwall. The Queen's foresight was legendary, but these documents represented a masterclass in long-term strategy. They were not merely suggestions for her grandson. They were ironclad directives intended to ensure that no person outside the direct Windsor bloodline could ever exert commercial influence or gain financial leverage over the estate. When William sat down to review these papers in the spring of 2026, he wasn't just reading the will of a grandmother. He was receiving a mandate from the greatest sovereign the world had known in a century. The existence of these instructions changes everything about how we view William's recent actions. It reframes his decision to dismantle the arrangements surrounding Camilla's family from a personal vendetta into a sacred duty. From William's perspective, he was simply the executor of his grandmother's final wishes. The instructions were clear. The duchy was to be a fortress, and any cracks in that fortress, any long-standing favors or cozy business arrangements had to be sealed immediately. This meant that the moment he took the reins, a metaphorical clock began ticking for everyone who had benefited from the previous era of relaxed oversight. For Camilla, this realization must have been a chilling one. For years, she had navigated the royal world with the confidence of someone who had the king's ear. She had seen her children and her sister integrated into the periphery of royal life, enjoying the prestige and the access that came with her elevation to queen. But what she perhaps failed to grasp was that the monarchy operates on two different levels. There is the emotional level of marriage and companionship, and then there is the structural level of the institution. While Charles may have prioritized the emotional, William was now the undisputed master of the structural, and the structure, as dictated by the late Queen, had no room for the Parker Bowles network. The retention of power within the bloodline is a concept that feels ancient, almost medieval, but in the context of a modern 21st century monarchy, it is a survival tactic. By ensuring that only those born into the line of succession have a say in the management of the duchy, the Queen was protecting the institution from the kind of influence peddling that has plagued other royal families across Europe. She saw the potential for conflict of interest long before the public did. She knew that as long as Camilla's relatives held positions of influence or commercial ties to royal land, the crown would be vulnerable to accusations of favoritism and nepotism. When William's team of auditors began their deep dive into the historical records of the estate, they weren't just looking for missing pence. They were looking for patterns. They were looking for names that appeared too often in business proposals or agricultural lease agreements. And as they turned the pages, the name of the Parker Bowles family allegedly began to surface with uncomfortable frequency. These weren't necessarily illegal acts, but they were symbols of a culture that William was determined to end. He saw a landscape where the boundaries had become too soft, where the friend of the family discount had become the standard operating procedure. One of the most fascinating aspects of this story is the silence of the king. Why did Charles allow these protocols to be put in place? Some argue that he simply didn't realize the full extent of the tripwires his mother had installed. Others suggest that he knew exactly what was happening but lacked the will to enforce the rules himself, knowing the domestic strife it would cause with Camilla. By allowing William to take full authority on that day in April, Charles effectively outsourced the cleaning of the house to his son. It allowed the king to keep his hands clean, while the Prince of Wales did the heavy lifting of dismantling his stepmother's shadow empire. This created a fascinating power vacuum for Camilla. For the first time since her marriage to Charles, she found herself facing a legal and financial wall that her husband would not or could not tear down for her. The instructions left by Queen Elizabeth II were a voice from the grave, reminding the family that the crown belongs to the bloodline and everyone else is merely a guest. As William continued his review, he wasn't just looking at the present, he was looking at the decades of history that had led to this point. He was looking at the ways in which the Parker Bowles family had become woven into the fabric, as the saying goes. And he was preparing to pull the thread. As we transition into the next chapter of this unfolding drama, we see the first specific targets of William's new administration. It wasn't just a general policy shift. It was a targeted removal of individuals. The first name to feel the weight of the new duke's authority was a man who had built a very public life on the fringes of the royal world. Tom Parker Bowles was about to discover that in the new reign of William, being the king's stepson didn't grant you a seat at the table of the duchy. In fact, it might have been the very thing that made you a liability. The audit was complete, the instructions were clear, and the first casualty was already in the crosshairs. The era of the unconsulted queen had truly begun, and the fallout was only just starting to reach the surface. When the doors of the Duchy of Cornwall's administrative offices were locked for the start of the Great Audit of 2026, many expected a routine review of agricultural yields and commercial leases. Instead, what emerged was a clinical dissection of influence. The first name to surface in the wake of Prince William's new authority was not a shadowy political figure or a disgruntled tenant, but a man who had become a fixture in British popular culture. Tom Parker Bowles, the son of the Queen and the stepson of the King, has spent years building a reputable career as a food writer and television personality. To the public, he is the charming, Epicurean face of the extended royal family. But to the forensic accountants working under the direction of the new Duke of Cornwall, he represented something entirely different, a commercial variable that required a definitive solution. The friction began when William's team started pulling files from the historical archives of the estate. As they dug through years of business inquiries and formal proposals, a pattern reportedly began to emerge. The claim is that over the course of several years, multiple attempts had been made to secure commercial opportunities involving duchy properties that had links, either directly or indirectly, back to members of Camilla's wider family network. Now, it is important to be clear, the records suggest that none of these proposals were ever actually approved. The system, even under King Charles, had held the line. But for William, the fact that the proposals were approved or not wasn't the main issue. The issue was the persistence of the attempts. From the perspective of a man who was preparing to one day wear the crown, these repeated approaches looked less like innocent business inquiries and more like a sustained effort to monetize proximity to the throne. William has spent his entire life watching the fallout that occurs when the line between royalty and commerce becomes blurred. He saw the struggles of his aunt and uncles in the 90s, and he has watched the ongoing global debate regarding his own brother's commercial ventures in America. For William, the Duchy of Cornwall is a sacred trust. It is the financial foundation of the monarchy, and he appears determined to ensure that it remains untainted by even the slightest hint of nepotism or pay-to-play influence. When the audit uncovered these historical links to companies associated with the Parker Bowles network, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted from professional to icy. Imagine the position William was in. He had just inherited one of the most valuable private estates in the world, only to discover that for years, the family of his stepmother had been knocking on the back door, looking for a way in. Even if those doors had remained locked, the mere fact that they were being tried was enough to trigger a defensive response. William is not a man who values old arrangements simply because they are comfortable. He values the integrity of the institution. The story suggests that William viewed these findings as a clear signal that a total decoupling was necessary. He reportedly felt that as long as there were active business interests from Camilla's side of the family attempting to engage with the duchy, the monarchy was at risk of a public relations disaster. It didn't matter that Tom Parker Bowles was a successful man in his own right. In the eyes of the new administration, he was a potential liability to the brand. The message being sent was one of absolute zero tolerance. The era of the extended royal family enjoying a soft, commercial relationship with the estate was being brought to a sudden, permanent end. For Tom, this must have felt like a cold splash of water. For years, he had navigated his life with a certain level of ease, moving between the worlds of high-level journalism and royal social circles. He was someone who was welcomed at the king's table, a man who had seemingly mastered the art of being royal adjacent without crossing the line. But William's audit wasn't interested in social graces. It was interested in the paper trail. The report claims that the scrutiny was so intense that even old agreements involving agricultural land, some stretching back decades to the time before Charles and Camilla were even married, were brought out into the light. These old agreements were technically legal. They were the kind of quiet, handshake deals that had defined the monarchy for centuries. Agreements that allowed certain families or networks to maintain a presence on royal land under terms that were perhaps more neighborly than commercial. But under William's new CEO-style management, neighborly was no longer a valid business category. One by one, these arrangements began to disappear from the ledger. They were marked for termination or non-renewal, replaced by a new set of standards that prioritized transparency and market value over family loyalty. This was the moment when the brutal fallout mentioned in royal circles began to take a physical shape. It wasn't just about a single business deal being blocked. It was about the systematic removal of a family's footprint from the landscape of the monarchy. The emotional weight of this cannot be ignored. Every time one of these old arrangements was canceled, it was a direct message to Camilla. Your family's influence ends here. It was a declaration that the Duchy of Cornwall was now a Windsor fortress, and the gates were being barred against anyone who didn't share the bloodline. As the news of these changes filtered back to Camilla, the tension within the royal household reportedly reached a breaking point. This wasn't a policy change that could be debated over tea. This was an executive order from a prince who now held the legal and financial upper hand. But while the situation with Tom Parker Bowles was causing significant friction, it was merely the opening act. The biggest shock, the one that would truly shatter the peace of the family and lead to an unprecedented confrontation, involved a person even closer to Camilla, her sister, Annabel Elliot. If Tom was a casualty of the audit, Annabel was about to become the victim of a total professional exile. The audit was moving from the ledgers to the very heart of the royal residences, and the next name on the list would change everything. If the audit of the duchy's land was a warning shot, what happened next was a direct hit to the very heart of the Queen's private world. To understand the gravity of this moment, you have to understand the unique position held by Annabel Elliot. She was not just a relative who visited for holidays or appeared at high-profile weddings. For decades, Annabel was woven into the very fabric of the monarchy's physical existence. As an accomplished interior designer, she had been a trusted member of King Charles's inner circle, long before he ascended to the throne. Her touch was everywhere from the restoration of grand manor houses to the subtle, elegant styling of the duchy's most prestigious holiday cottages. She was the woman who gave the king's world its aesthetic soul, and because of that, she enjoyed a level of access that most people could only dream of. In the world of the royals, access is a currency more valuable than gold. Having the right to walk through private corridors, to influence the atmosphere of the king's residences, and to be present during the quietest moments of royal life provides a kind of security that is almost impossible to penetrate. For years, Annabel's presence was simply accepted. She was part of the scenery, a professional who happened to be the sister of the woman the king loved. While critics occasionally raised their eyebrows and questioned whether her lucrative contracts should have faced more rigorous public scrutiny, those whispers never gained any real traction. As long as Charles was the Duke of Cornwall, Annabel was safe. Her position was considered a permanent fixture of the royal landscape. But the moment Prince William took control of the duchy, the landscape changed overnight. William did not look at Annabel as a beloved aunt or a family friend. He looked at her through the clinical lens of an administrator reviewing a massive corporate entity. According to those close to the situation, when the new Duke of Wales began his review of household expenditures and professional appointments, Annabel's name reportedly landed directly in front of him. It wasn't buried in a footnote or hidden in the fine print. Her contracts represented a significant and ongoing financial commitment from the estate, And in the new era of transparency and bloodline-only protection, those contracts stood out like a beacon. What followed has been described as a midnight execution of professional ties. There was no long, drawn-out investigation. There were no committee meetings to discuss a gradual transition or a way to phase her out gracefully. There was no public dispute that would allow for a face-saving narrative. Instead, the story goes that the contracts were simply terminated. In the time it takes to sign a letter, decades of professional service and proximity to the crown were brought to a cold, hard stop. For the Parker Bowles family, this wasn't just a business decision, it felt like a deliberate act of aggression. It was a clear, unmistakable signal that the new administration had no interest in maintaining the old ways. The shockwaves from this decision sent the Parker Bowles inner circle into a state of total panic. For them, Annabelle's role was more than just a job, it was a symbol of their permanence. As long as she was working on the royal properties, the family felt they had a stake in the kingdom. Once that disappeared, the reality of their new situation began to sink in. They were being evicted, not just from the payroll, but from the inner sanctum of power. William wasn't just saving money, he was reclaiming the space. He was asserting that the duchy was a professional institution, not a family business where roles were handed out based on who you knew or who you were related to. For Camilla, watching her sister be removed so unceremoniously must have been a devastating experience. It is one thing to have your son's business proposals rejected, but it is another thing entirely to see your sister, a woman who had been a loyal servant to the king's vision for years, cast aside like a common contractor. It was a punch to the stomach that left the entire family reeling. The message from William was loud and clear. Nobody was untouchable. No amount of history, no level of friendship, and no family connection would be enough to bypass the new rules of the Windsor bloodline. But why was William so decisive? Why didn't he offer her a smaller role or a consultative position to keep the peace? This is where the story moves from the professional into the deeply personal. To understand the intensity of William's actions, we have to look back at the history these people shared, a history that involves far more than interior design. It involves a house, a secret, and the darkest years of the 29th century for the House of Windsor. As we move into the next part of this investigation, we uncover the hidden reason why Annabel Elliott's presence may have been a constant, painful reminder of a past that William was finally ready to bury for good. The contracts were gone, but the memories remained, and those memories were about to become the center of a royal explosion. The history of the monarchy is written in blood and stone, but it is also written in the quiet corners of country houses where secrets are kept behind heavy velvet curtains. To the outside world, the dismissal of Annabel Elliott looked like a clinical business decision made by a modernizing prince. But to those who understand the deep, jagged scars of the royal past, this was something far more visceral. It was the final settling of a debt that had been outstanding for over 30 years. You see, in the world of Prince William, there is no such thing as a clean slate. Every face in the royal circle carries a history, and for Annabel, that history was inextricably linked to the greatest tragedy of William's life. During the 80s and the 90s, when the world was captivated and then horrified by the slow-motion collapse of the marriage between Charles and Diana, there were very few people whom Charles could truly trust. He needed loyalty, but more than that, he needed discretion. He needed places where he and Camilla could exist away from the prying eyes of the paparazzi and the suffocating judgment of the public. According to the long-standing narratives of that era, one of those most vital sanctuaries was the home of Annabel Elliott. It was within those private walls that a relationship was sheltered and sustained during its most controversial years. For a young Prince William, watching his mother's world unravel, the people who facilitated his father's other life must have occupied a very specific, very painful place in his memory. Whether William consciously thinks about those years every time he signs a document is something only he can know. But for the people watching this drama unfold in 2026, the connection was impossible to ignore. When William terminated those contracts, he wasn't just firing an interior designer. He was closing the door on a woman who had played a central role in the era that broke his mother's heart. This is the psychological layer that makes the retention of this story so high. It isn't just about money, it's about the North remembering. It is the story of a son who has grown into a man of immense power, finally standing in a position where he can decide who belongs in the royal future and who is a relic of a painful past. For Camilla, this must have been her greatest fear realized. She had spent decades rehabilitating her image, moving from the other woman to the queen consort, bringing her family along with her into the light of respectability. And in one swift stroke, William had reminded her that the past is never truly dead. The emotional fallout from Annabelle's dismissal was not a quiet affair. According to reports from those inside the royal circle, the moment the news reached the Parker Bowles family, the pressure on Camilla exploded. It started with the phone calls. The first call reportedly came from Tom Parker Bowles. The tone was not one of confusion, but of urgent frustration. He allegedly made it clear that the family could not simply sit back while their connections and arrangements were being systematically dismantled. They had spent years building a position of security, and now it was disappearing before their eyes. But the call that supposedly changed the temperature of the entire household came from Annabelle herself. The story says that Camilla took this call behind closed doors at Clarence's house, the very residence where she and Charles had built their life together. Staff members reportedly lingered in the hallways, sensing the shift in the air. For nearly an hour, the Queen was locked away, hushed tones eventually giving way to something much more alarming. Suddenly, a genuine outburst was heard, a voice raised in a way that is rarely, if ever, heard from the composed and guarded Queen Camilla. When she finally emerged from that room, witnesses say she looked noticeably shaken. She wasn't just angry, she was terrified. And that terror likely stemmed from a very simple, very dangerous realization. Annabelle Elliott was not just a disgruntled former contractor. She was a woman who had been present for the most private, most secret chapters of the King and Queen's lives. She had witnessed the conversations, the vulnerabilities, and the hidden events that the public has never seen. When someone with that level of intimate knowledge is suddenly cast out into the cold, they become the most dangerous person in the kingdom. The theory circulating among royal observers is as chilling as it is simple. It is suggested that Annabelle's message to her sister boiled down to a single, devastating ultimatum: get this decision reversed or face the consequences. What those consequences might be remains a matter of intense speculation. Does she possess diaries? Are there letters? Or is it simply the weight of the truth she could tell if she no longer felt a sense of loyalty to the crown? Whatever the threat was, it was enough to drive Camilla to do something she rarely does. She went straight to the king, not as a partner seeking advice, but as a wife demanding an intervention. She arrived to see Charles carrying the weight of her entire family's future on her shoulders. She laid it all out: the contracts, the growing fury of her children, the pressure from her sister, and the perceived insult to their entire bloodline. She asked him to pick up the phone. She asked him to tell William that he had gone too far. She asked him to remember the loyalty Annabelle had shown them when the rest of the world was against them. But what Camilla discovered in that meeting would leave her facing a problem far bigger than a lost contract. She was about to find out that the king she married was no longer the same man who had once shielded her from the world. The power had shifted, and she was standing on the wrong side of the line. The final confrontation was here, and the king's response would change the monarchy forever. The final confrontation did not take place in a grand throne room or under the watchful eyes of the world's cameras. It happened in the quiet, shadow-filled spaces where the monarchy actually lives. According to those who were present in the outer hallways of the palace, the atmosphere on that afternoon was thick, with a tension that felt almost physical. Camilla arrived to see King Charles carrying more than just the weight of her family's frustration. She was carrying the desperate hope that her husband's love would once again prove stronger than the cold machinery of the state. For 30 years, that had been the rule of their lives. Charles had always been her protector, her champion, and the man who would move mountains to ensure her comfort. But as she stepped into his private study, she was about to encounter a man she no longer recognized. The conversation reportedly began with a plea for intervention. Camilla laid out the situation with the clinical precision of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. She spoke of Annabelle's decades of service, of the loyalty the family had shown during the darkest hours of the previous century, and of the sheer, unmitigated insult of being discarded by a stepson's audit. She reportedly expected the king to be as outraged as she was. She expected him to reach for the telephone, to call William, and to remind the prince that there are certain family boundaries that must never be crossed. But instead of anger, she was met with something far more devastating, a profound and unshakable silence. According to the accounts of this meeting, Charles remained remarkably calm throughout his wife's appeal. He did not raise his voice. He did not offer a passionate defense of his son's actions, nor did he apologize for them. Instead, he reportedly explained the situation in the language of a sovereign, not a husband. He told her that the transfer of authority on the 26th of April, 2026, was not a temporary arrangement or a symbolic gesture. It was a total and legally binding shift of power. The framework of the Duchy of Cornwall was now entirely in William's hands, and that framework, reinforced by the instructions left by the late Queen, could not simply be undone because a family member was unhappy with the consequences. This is the moment where the story flips the long-standing narrative of the royal family on its head. For decades, critics of the king have argued that he would always prioritize Camilla above all else. They claim that his devotion to her was his greatest weakness, the one thing that could cloud his judgment or sway his loyalty to the crown. But in this room, on this day, Charles reportedly chose a different path. He chose the institution. He chose his heir. He chose the future over the comforts of the past. When Camilla pointed out that he was the one who had signed the documents, that he was the one who had made this possible, Charles didn't blink. He reportedly acknowledged his role in the decision, but made it clear that the choice had been made for the good of the monarchy's survival. It was at this point that the composure of the Queen Consort reportedly shattered. The staff members waiting in the corridor outside allegedly heard a genuine outburst, a voice raised in a mixture of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. It was the sound of a woman realizing that the ground she had stood on for 20 years was no longer solid. The quiet refusal of the king was a message that resonated far beyond the walls of the study. It signaled that the era of the Parker Bowles influence was not just being challenged by William, it was being allowed to fade by Charles himself. When Camilla finally emerged from that room, she was described as looking noticeably shaken, a woman who had gone into a room as a powerful queen and come out as a wife who had been told no. But as the dust settled on this historic confrontation, a much more dangerous question began to circulate through the palace. If the king would not help her, and if the prince would not listen to her, what would the family do next? Specifically, what would Annabel Elliot do? We must return to the idea of the secret keeper. Annabel was not a distant relative. She was the silent witness to the most controversial chapters of royal history. She knows where the proverbial bodies are buried because, in many cases, she was the one who helped hide them. When a person with that level of intimate knowledge is stripped of their professional role, their access, and their security, the dynamic changes from loyalty to survival. The theory that has kept royal observers awake for months is that the Parker Bowles family may now possess the ultimate weapon: information. If Annabel felt abandoned by the sister she had protected for 3 decades, and if she felt betrayed by the king she had served with such discretion, what is to stop the secrets of the past from finally coming to light? This is the open loop that haunts the halls of Windsor. William may have cleaned the house and protected the bloodline's money, but in doing so, he may have created a category of outsiders who no longer feel bound by the rules of royal silence. The brutal fallout mentioned at the beginning of this story may not just be about a lost contract or a blocked business deal. It may be the beginning of a cold war within the family, where the weapons are memories and the battlefield is the public's perception of the throne. As we look at the monarchy in 2026, the image of Prince William has transformed. He is no longer just the grieving son or the dutiful heir. He is the man who looked at the most powerful network of influence in his father's life and decided to dismantle it, one piece at a time. He has proven that he is willing to risk domestic peace to ensure the long-term integrity of the crown. He has shown that the shadow of Diana and the instructions of Elizabeth II carry more weight in his heart than the demands of his stepmother's family. But as the gates of the Duchy of Cornwall close and the Parker Bowles family retreats into the shadows, we are left with a chilling final thought. A chapter has indeed been closed, but in the world of the royals, nothing is ever truly forgotten. The secrets that Annabel Elliot holds are still there, tucked away in the memories of those quiet country houses. William has the keys to the kingdom, and he has the authority over the land, but he does not yet have control over the stories that remain untold. The question is no longer whether William can protect the crown from the influence of the outsiders. The question is, what happens when the outsiders decide they have nothing left to lose? The 26th of April was a victory for the bloodline, but in the long, dark history of the House of Windsor, every victory comes with a price that must eventually be paid.